From an AV perspective, our virtual folks are plugged in, and we've got a co-chair to welcome us. So this is a great new tradition. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mona. I think everybody knows me. And I'm the co-chair with Michael Miracle. He's unable to make it today. So I just want to welcome everybody to the meeting that's here in the room and everybody that's on virtually as well. So thank you so much for coming to the meeting and continuing to be part of this. I think we're starting to really dive in to what our charge is. We've had some really good conversation. We've got some good data. We're going to get a lot more good data in the coming weeks. And today I think we have a really good interactive meeting planned for us. So Miles is going to go over the agenda with us, and we'll kind of involve everybody in the group, Cindy and Emma. And so thank you all.
Thank you so much, Mona. And it's great to have the co-chairs involved. Michael and Mona really helped us set the agenda for today. And as Mona said, it's going to be a really collaborative meeting. So I do want to acknowledge our planning team who's here, who you know us all, but we've also got some P&Z members. Suzanne Caskey here in the room. Suzanne, is Joe here, or is he virtual?
I thought he was going to come, and I think Chelsea was going to be virtual, but she also had a meeting of her own that stopped, not until 4:30.
Excellent. So for our breakouts tonight, we should have Joe from Planning and Zoning as well as Chelsea and Emma and Abby. I don't know if we can acknowledge our P&Z members who may be on virtually.
Hey guys, where are you? There's separate firehouse.
Hey Chris, we're in the police department, another emergency service office.
A nearby one too.
We'll be right.
See you soon. And Evie and Emma, I want to make sure we acknowledge our P&Z members if we have any on virtually.
Yeah, thanks, Miles. None currently, but I will make sure to give them a shout out if any join.
I'm on. It's Forrest.
Oh, hey, Forrest.
How you doing, guys? I'm on a phone, so unfortunately you can't be graced by my beauty right now.
No worries, Morrison. We were actually acknowledging the P&Z, the planning and zoning members, but
my bad. Sorry. That's the other problem with the phone.
Whereas our hybrid meeting's fun. But we do acknowledge it is fall break. And so we have a bigger group virtually than we normally do. It looks like with the planning team, 13 of us virtually. So if we go to the next slide, we'll take a quick look at agenda and keep us rolling. We do have a packed agenda tonight simply because it does include some breakout discussions during our last meeting. I think this group, rightfully, we were all craving some focus and narrowing of our scope and maybe some small group discussions. So what we're going to do tonight is quickly recap what we've heard today, really focusing our scope and the problems that we are trying to solve, the challenges that we are rising to meet. Then we're going to go into breakout sessions for the bulk of the meeting for about 50 minutes. We're going to break out and really answer some of the questions that the group was focusing in on last time in terms of when we think about how the community looks, feels, and functions in the context of land use. What do we want to see more of? What do we want to see less of? And so that'll be the two lists we're going to make during breakouts. And we're going to do that for about the first half hour, and then we're going to start filtering by some of our values that we'll take a look at tonight as well. And then we've got about 30 minutes for reporting, so we can all come back together and share what we want to see more of and less of, identify the big themes that we want to really focus in on as we get into narrowing our focus areas and really refining that scope that we heard. It was such a priority for all of us coming out of the last meeting. And then we are going to take a little look into the future at our evolving focus areas, the process for getting to recommendations and how we move forward, and then just some homework and logistics and administrative housekeeping. So with that, on our next slide, we had a little bit of, and Emma, I think if you could maybe stop sharing, we moved this slide down. Hey, welcome, Chris. We actually moved this slide after values. We want to summarize the roadmap after we do the next one. So Emma, I'm going to buy you a little time because I know that you are presenting what we heard since you were taking such great notes and really capturing the essence of the conversation we had last time. So we just called a little audible. Emma, thanks for bearing with us. And hopefully I bought you enough time to collect your thoughts and walk us through the big themes coming out of our last meeting when we were focused on our values.
No problem. Thanks, Miles. And before I get going, I just want to acknowledge Chelsea Clark from Planning and Zoning has joined us virtually. So thank you, Chelsea, for being here. And
Thanks.
of course. So really, as Miles mentioned, what we wanted to start off with is a little bit of a summary of what we heard from the discussion last 2 weeks ago, just because it was so lively and productive in response to those BOCC questions. And so the first takeaway that we really gleaned was this idea of regionality and addressing these issues from a regional approach. So involving different municipalities and communities to address this climate and growth issue, because we do know it is not unique to Pitkin County. The second takeaway that we gleaned from the discussion was this idea of redefining growth and activity. We heard pretty clearly that activity indicators are a better proxy for this kind of sense of uncontrolled growth that we see in Pitkin County rather than population growth, because population is rather stagnant. So it's those activity indicators like peak population, like sales and lodging taxes, that are a better proxy for that growth we feel. The third insight we heard was that while the land use code is limited in what it can address, it can't address, every single issue that was discussed. It is rather powerful in, being able to impact and change some of these activity levels. So kind of acknowledging opportunities and power within the land use code. And then the fourth insight here on the screen in the lower left is applying land use levers to desired community outcomes. I believe it was one community or one committee member who, really was the catalyst for this exercise we're going to complete today, which is more or less of. So how do we use these land use levers to incentivize desired activity and de-incentivize undesired activity? So we'll get to that today. And then fifth and final is the really sense and desire for committee scoping. It was clear to us that there was a general kind of sense of both overwhelm and invigoration for the process, but really a need to define the problem statement and also the scope of what this committee is going to impact. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it to Abby or Miles in the room here to talk through focusing our scope process.
Thanks, and I'm actually going to flip it to Cindy. We have another audible. Kara is got pulled out for just a second, so Cindy is going to jump in. Thank you so much, Cindy.
Right. And I'm just going to review with you that scope that we've talked about several times in terms of what is the problem we're trying to solve, what has the board presented to us in terms of our goals, our tools, and the outcomes. So we talk a lot about meeting the climate action goals as foundational in our scope, and using growth management and the land use code. And I'd add in here, we don't want to forget the other codes. We've got the building code, the energy code, that are also tools for us here. And then the outcomes, that we want to do this while we're creating an equitable, sustainable, and resilient quality of life and economy for the future. So those are big tasks in the scope, but that's what we want to focus on. The next thing is focusing that scope using the land use code as our foundational tool, and how that reflects on our community values. If you go to the land use code, way back in the 70s, it lists a whole section on what are our values, what are our policies, which are really the values. And taking a look at that with the values that you guys have already identified, going around the table on with added values and scope from what the board has given us. And we also, going back, we want to look at what we've learned so far, where we were with growth management in the past and where we are today. the past that I explained in one of our meetings, and then Suzanne Wolf explained where we are today with our growth management process. Hi, Joe. And then redefining growth. And what does that look like? We really want to look at, we keep talking about what is growth, and our old measurements of growth, like population or numbers of permits and that kind of thing, versus the things we're looking at today, which have to do with density, intensity, and activity levels in terms of the definition of growth. And just clarifying the problem a little bit more with our next slide. And what we're talking about is what we've learned so far, and I really love this slide, because I think it'll help you kind of just summarize what we've learned so far. And we've learned that growth is no longer defined as density, but it's also intensity and activity, as we've talked about. We've also learned that many of the homes are no longer acting like residential uses, and which was the initial intent, and often have commercial-like uses associated with them today. We've also learned that the land use code is the most influential tool that we have in this exercise, and it shapes our land use patterns and the activities we want to see. And we also have learned that the trends have direct impacts on our climate and on our environmental values, and affect equity as well as community carrying capacity and economic resiliency. So that's just a summary of what we've learned so far today. And then to summarize very quickly, the shared values that I think we've all come to, that we'll talk about when we get into our breakout sessions, and what we want to see more of and less of, and how we filter with our values. That climate action and environmental sustainability are very important to us as a community, that a healthy, resilient, and inclusive economy is very important, that equity and affordability are important, that quality of life is important. And then what we heard in addition was the rural preservation is very important, as well as some idea of community carrying capacity. So those are the other values that we've added in to what the board kind of threw out in their mission. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Abby.
Are there any
Cindy, thank you.
For comments?
Oh, I'm sorry, Tim.
Could you go back 2 slides
Yeah. I think,
there? 2 questions. The not acting like residential use for homes. Can you expand on that? What do you mean by commercial? And then I have a question about community carrying capacity. What's the meaning of that?
okay. Well, what we've talked about is that activities in residences today aren't always just residential, taking the kids to school, coming home, having your family affairs. It's now we've added in the short-term rental aspect of homes, which is a commercial aspect of a residence. And we've also, in many cases, added in the special events as in these homes. Not only are they acting like special event centers or venues in some cases, and commercial or short-term rentals or even long-term rentals. They're not just your typical residential type home. And as far as carrying,
Cindy, one thing too, this was sort of the summary of what we've heard from the groups. So I just wanted to add a little context too. I think what we heard, particularly in our last conversation, was just that I think Debbie made the good comment that stuck in my brain about, 20 cars at a certain house, servicing all the different pool landscaping needs, that is almost more of a commercial type of use, some level of activity you would see associated with commercial rather than residential, just given the size of some of these and the activity that they generate.
yeah, and I think with that also the built-in sort of microeconomy that they have, by having not only do you need one caretaker unit, you need to buy another house to house the people that work for you in your home. It's a whole new economy of a microeconomy of a home and how it functions. And so I think that's something to keep in mind as we go. And then when you're asking about carrying capacity, I think we've thrown that around a lot. Like, what is our carrying capacity? We've talked about from an environmental, natural resource perspective, water, air quality, all of that as carrying capacity, but also there's that quality of life carrying capacity. When is it that you say, it's just, I don't want to be here anymore from a quality of life perspective? Where is that threshold in that quality of life carrying capacity? That's how I would answer that, but how would you answer that?
And I think it's an excellent answer, and I think it's really up for all of you to kind of help refine that these should be called draft hypotheses. This is what's beginning to emerge and answering the question that we've all been discussing really since the first meeting is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And so getting to some of these hypotheses, they can and should evolve. We're doing our best to try to distill down and narrow the focus of what we heard from you all. So if there's something here that doesn't quite hit the mark, we should be talking about it. And Chris, I don't know if you had a comment on.
Well, I mean, just a comment, I think the 20 plus FTEs a day at residences certainly feels to me, like not normal residential use. Although I suppose that, just depends on who you ask. But I just agree with you that I think that's what I was hearing the group reflect. And I know it's the carrying capacity question. My recollection of where we left it was that it was something that we really needed to define because different members of the community would probably define it differently.
I think that's a really good point. You come into those common definitions, so that we're beginning to focus in on those is going to be super important on all of these terms. So Tim, thank you for bringing up, I think, two of the key points that we're going to want to work through. And Rick, did you have a comment?
Well, on that point, I'm waiting for a person I work with to send me an organization chart of their organization on a state project. And it's like a corporate diagram, which really illustrates that the 20 FTEs that we see there are only the tip of the iceberg. You're not seeing the ski instructors or the waiters or the chefs. You're seeing the service people that arrive in trucks. But above that is the legal team and the planning team and the ownership and the corporate accountant and et cetera. And it is a mini economy. It's a huge mini economy. And then my other comment was on the next slide, we had the 6 things, I think.
Yeah.
My experience is there's a couple of them that are so contentious that they stop conversations about growth and development in their tracks. Probably the one being quality of life. We've had several things stall out over the years, and it all boiled down to, are we trying to preserve small town character or the quintessential downtown, or what are we trying to do here? And that's where it always got too blocked. It wasn't about climate action because everybody's in favor of that. It wasn't about a great economy or equity, but when it became affordable housing or quality of life or some of those community carrying capacity was a big one too. We would delay infrastructure improvements so that we wouldn't have to say yes, right? And that's cost us unknown millions of dollars, because now we're going to have to expand our infrastructure to do some of the things that we were trying to do. So those are, I don't want to forget that thread, so I wanted to get it out there.
I think that's another really great example of how we need to come to those common definitions of our shared values, and how do we define quality of life? I think one of the things when I think about quality of life, it almost encompasses all of those other things, and it's kind of, the umbrella that's over the top of it. So I think that's what this group will be working through, is how do we come to those definitions, those redefinitions of carrying capacity, quality of life, growth itself.
Miles, we have Brian and Blake online. Raise their hand.
Oh, perfect. Brian, let's go with you and then Blake on deck.
Thanks, everybody. Sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I just want to give a shout out and kudos to the staff for the October 14th memo that was drafted and put in the packet. I thought that was extremely helpful in framing the issues. And what it made me wonder is, for this committee and this activity, is the land use code the only lever that is in our domain for discussion? And the reason I ask that is when we think about growth being comprised of population, density, intensity, and activity, and when we reflect on the BOCC vision and the statement being really around climate and climate goals, right? Meet our climate action goals. I can think of ways in which you can have growth without imperiling the climate, right? But most of the ways in which those are manifested through maybe the building code or the energy code by, what fuels are used and what building performance is and so on. So I guess where I'm getting tripped up is, are we focused only on the land use code in this dialogue, or are those other codes and other policies potentially in play?
Brian, that's an excellent question. And as we look at the roadmap, maybe this is a good time to transition to it. I think we want to start looking at what are those levers, and the group at our last meeting acknowledged the land use code is a very powerful tool, and we should see if perhaps we're asking too much from it. And so I think our charge is to look first through the lens of the land use code, but then also look at what's maybe adjacent or outside of that code that should be part of the collective recommendations that come out of this body, or areas that are identified for further study, further action. So I would say, Brian, to your point, where we want to play is in that sandbox of land use code, but it should not preclude thinking big and innovating on areas outside of the code for further study, for recommendations that should be considered in addition to recommendations regarding land use. Does that begin to narrow it down? I know it's a little bit of a yes and answer.
It is, but actually, I think it makes the problem a little bit more solvable if we enlarge it. What I'm hearing is focus first on the land use code. And I think for things like density, intensity, and activity type, the land use code is a perfect tool for it. But I think when we start reflecting on the climate impacts, we're going to want to look at the building code and the energy code. I can imagine us doing for a carbon-free building project, whether it's a new or a retrofit. I can imagine us having looser restrictions on growth management than it might be if it's just sort of the garden variety that we're seeing today, as one example.
I would also add, Brian, that the land use code, it's subtle in some ways as well. I mean, just in terms of where density is, land use patterns, that sort of thing affect our transportation aspect of climate change. And, how in some of our intensity issues, maybe with traffic congestion and that sort of thing. So I think you're right. Let's use the land use code to the greatest extent we can to get the biggest influence in the areas that we want to. But as Miles said, let's not limit ourselves. What I'm looking forward to tonight is when you're in your groups, listening to what you're talking about and what you want to see more of and less of, because I'm going to start going, oh, that could happen in the land use code. Oh, maybe that should happen in the building code. Maybe that should happen in the energy code, or maybe that's a partnership with blah, 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 that kind of thing. So we're going to start trying to distill those things for you.
Yeah, and Glenn, and then we'll go to Blake, alternating between in-person and virtual.
If you go back a couple slides, I don't see that you reflect the comment that I made about managing public capital improvement projects, because that doesn't require any code work. It's just a matter of elected officials and CDOT working together, so you don't have multiple capital improvement projects or repair projects taking place at the same time like we saw this summer. And I don't know to what extent you have any coordination between the various elected officials and state agencies. And you think about it, doing whatever utility work they were doing in town, at the same time they're repaving the road and redoing the roundabout and doing bus stops. It seems like the elected officials and these various organizations aren't talking to each other and coordinating their public improvement projects. And that seems like a pretty simple thing to do.
That's
So more coordination.
More of. I think that's a great something we want to see more of. And it was not explicitly called out, but in that sort of regionality and the required regional coordination. So, Glenn, it's a good point, and something that I think we want to put on our list of seeing more of is intergovernmental coordination. And then Blake, I don't see your hand still up, but I don't know if you have a question and comment.
I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay, great. Excellent. Oh, Cliff, yes.
I think a distinction needs to be made about planning, zoning. Zoning is an important tool or a lever, as the term was just used, that we could use to manage growth.
Absolutely. And that's one of the tools, I think, as Cindy mentioned, it's within land use code, there are a lot of component elements that are included and definitely we should be looking at all of those things. And I want to make sure we preserve enough time to get into breakouts and really start making those lists and getting deeper into this so we can be refining. But this roadmap you saw at our very first meeting, and it's evolved substantially through conversations with all of you, with Michael and Mona. And Abby's going to walk us through really quick kind of the arc of our planning trajectory. And one of the big things you're going to notice, we substituted meeting dates for meeting milestones. So if, you know, milestone number 9, for example, in climate data becomes 2 meetings, if you all feel like that's warranted, we have the flexibility to do that. So we didn't want to box this in, but Abby, hopefully that's enough of a setup, and thanks for walking us through this.
Yeah, and hopefully everybody can hear me. I understand that my sound quality was not great the last time. So please let me know if that's not the case. So really quickly, this is a process. It's always good to know where you are in the process, where you've been, where we are, and where we are going. So everything that is in that light gray is where we've been. We've talked a lot up to this point about the history of growth management, of GMQS, how it operates. And last time we spent a lot of time talking about these mega trends as they inform some of the problems that we're trying to solve and the hypotheses that we want to test. Today is all about really focusing that scope of work, being clear about the problem we're trying to solve, and really starting to have those conversations about what does that desirable future look like. Moving forward in that phase 3, so evaluate alternatives. These, as Miles pointed out, they're milestones, so we're not going to link them to specific dates, but really through November and December, what we hope to do is arm you with the data to begin to draw the relationships between the land use code and the impact on climate, the land use code and the impact on the economy and that activity and the intensity. So that's the intent with the next couple of meetings is our hope. And then beginning to say how I'm really looking at that land use, at the land use levers and say, what can it do, right? And what can it do? So we explore that sandbox and then everything, Brian, to your point, really outside of that sandbox. What else do we need to be exploring? As we move into phase 4, this is finalized recommendations. So here's where we're going to take all that really good thinking in the data and start to put pen to paper and pull together some of the alternatives, the recommendations, and the final recommendations. So I know you've all seen this before, it's evolved. And so hopefully it's just helpful to know kind of as Miles said, the trajectory or the arc of the work that we're all doing together. So with that, and if there's not any questions, I think we can move to the next section. Oh, you're all muted in the room. Yeah.
We're good. Okay, so this will continue to evolve. The roadmap, this was 2.0. There's probably going to be a 2.1. You know, we may get to a 3.0 at some point. So based on your feedback, we're going to continue to narrow our scope and have a path that we follow through this process. But we're right on agenda, a little bit over for our breakout session. So this is the bulk of it. We heard from you all. It would really be helpful to break out, have some small group discussion, and really lean into when we're thinking about our community's look, feel, and function. What do we want to see more of? What do we want to see less of in the context of land use? And make the list of what we want to see more of. We know some of those things are likely going to get outside the box of land use, and that's okay. A lot of that stuff can be tied back to it, and then also less of. And we do, as you'll see on screen here in a minute, have the homework assignment that we've heard from folks who can't be here because it is fall break, including one of our co-chairs, sent us his list. And so we've got Michael's list along with what else we've received today to just get us thinking about it. So Emma, if you want to pull up our sample list, and we'll have a little discussion in the room on our assignment to make sure it's very clear when we break out what we're going to be doing. Kristen.
One thing that struck me a bunch is there a third category, which is we just want it to stay the same. We don't want it to go less. We don't want it to go more. We want it to be the same.
We can color outside the box.
I mean,
yeah.
Let's see how the groups go, but
I personally like it, and I would say our intent here with this exercise is to keep the focus wide open. You know, we want to be looking through the lens of land use, yes, but things we want more of, less of, and I would would vote yes, stay the same. I mean, what do we want to hang on to?
Applicable.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a spectrum, right? You know, so I think identifying where of more change, less change, maybe just preservation's kind of in the middle of that continuum. So I would say we absolutely can, and because this is pretty small here, just to get us thinking about picking up our last conversation, what we want to hear more of, what we want to hear less of. What we heard is more of creation of housing that's locally based careers can afford, enough permit and fee revenue for the county, I believe that is, to function. Enough work that longstanding contractors and builders are able to drive. Code requirements for employee housing, specifically houses exceeding 5750 in the square footage category, and then less of car type job generation, further distancing housing pricing from what locally based careers can afford, growth in residential serving workforce that cannibalizes longstanding general public servant businesses and sectors such as schools, restaurants, recreation, et cetera, and of the home should act like homes hypotheses that we were discussing. And we want to see less of further growth of a wage distorted labor market. And I'll summarize some of these and we can get into them in breakouts. And the busyness economy, rushing to and from, what comes from those, dozens of FTEs at certain houses. Short-term rentals flagged is in the less of category because they contribute to all of the above. And then homes exceeding 5750, including below grade, fewer or no exemptions. So just to get us started in the types of things, you can see a pretty heavy land use focus, but also some things that are pretty clearly outside of that box as well. So for the exercise tonight, we have a pretty big group virtually. They're going to do their own breakout session. Fortunately, there's a lot of project team on that virtual meeting to help facilitate that. Here in the room, we're just going to split in half. We're going to count off by twos and break out with our facilitation team. So we're a little shorthanded with Kara popping out, so I may kind of float back and forth a little bit. But in group one, we're going to have Cindy and Mona facilitating that group. So we're going to count off all the ones. We'll go with Cindy and Mona, and then Alex and Marcy will be our group twos, and I'll float back and forth to kind of help keep the conversation going, and maybe we'll get Kara back before we report out. But so our task, I think, is fairly simple. We're not going to put a lot of rules and structure on it. Thinking about what you want to see more of and less of, and we'll make the list, and then we'll come back together and report out in the context of our values. So when we have about 20 minutes left, maybe 15 now in our session, what we're going to do is start to look at values and say, if we want to see more of this, what value is this really associated with? And I would add, maybe we should say, can they co-influence it? So we're already bending the rules, and if there's things we want to preserve and keep the same, I think we like those too. So this is really designed just to get us talking and thinking about where we're going, what data we're going to need as we work through getting to the areas we want to focus on. And kind of the concept that we talked about, I think, Chris, you brought it up at our last meeting of guiding principles. We're kind of calling those areas of focus to begin to narrow our scope into what are those large pillars, the big themes that are coming out that we can really get into as we move forward. So that's kind of the path that we're moving down. But for now, hopefully this is a fun exercise to really think big and be revolutionary. Tim, to steal your word from the last meeting about what we want to see more of, what we want to see less of, what we simply want to hang out to and preserve. So with that, maybe we should count off, and I do want to acknowledge we've got Joe and Suzanne, who are going to be subject matter experts. I'll let them arm wrestle on which group they're going to go with. My money's on Suzanne, but but we'll just count off. So Glenn, if you want to start with you as a one.
One,
Two. One.
Two.
one, two, one, two, one, two,
One. Two. Excellent. So how about we do ones over here and twos over here and
Okay. Hi, everyone. So they've just muted us in the room, so they can't hear us, which is great. And we have a really robust online group, which is fantastic. Really quickly, just in terms of roles. So I'll help to facilitate. Emma is going to capture some of your ideas on this board. We have Ellen really as our subject matter expert, and I know Forrest and Chelsea are here from planning and zoning, and I think it can provide just some perspective if the group is desiring that. So let me just hopefully you can hear me okay. I know the quality in the room is not okay. It's okay. Okay, fantastic. I'm glad to hear that. So let me just repeat our task. Our task is to give some thought to what with land use as the underlying consideration, what do you want to see more of or less of, or perhaps the same of in terms of how the community looks, feels, and functions? So it's a big question, but I think if somebody starts, we'll get the juices flowing. And then in about 20 minutes, we'll sort of pause and we'll give some consideration to the values that all of this is expressing. So when we do a report out, we'll want to report out with that lens, with the values lens. So anybody want to start? Anybody want to kick things off here? Or do we need any further clarification?
This is Forrest. I'd like to see more multifamily and commercial zoning on the transportation corridor to help with the carbon footprint and bringing equity in that the workers can live in Pickens County now.
Queen is finding love.
And Forrest, just make sure that we capture that accurately. You were breaking up just a bit, so I just want to make sure that your thoughts are captured. I mean, you may not be able to see if you're joining via phone, so let us know.
No, that looks just right.
Perfect, thank you.
This is Chelsea Clark here. I thought that, and this is just a point of clarification because I wasn't planning on expressing my opinion. As a P&Z participant, we're not supposed to give our opinions in this session. Is that correct?
I think that's right. I think that's right in general. Really, P&Z really serving as a resource team as opposed to sort of an active member of the committee. So Chelsea, thank you for that clarification.
Sure. Yeah, that was the instruction I got from Cindy. So I just wanted to stay in my lane, and I will. But I'm happy to be a resource, and I'm really excited to listen to everyone's ideas. So I'll be quiet now.
Appreciate that, Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Who else? I know we've been sort of eager to get at this question. Yes, Lydia.
Hey, Lydia, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Anyway, I chose a list and they're short thoughts and the things that I think we need to see more of. And I really did try to keep it in the land use code realm. More sustainable green building. And I was reading some articles online. So these came from some of them came from other mountain communities, net zero deed restricted workforce housing, equity within the county as far as affordable housing, preservation of ranch rural properties with an emphasis on wildlife mitigation corridors, repurposing of buildings or zoning commercial to residential, management of carbon emissions. And I read a little bit about master plan communities, and I thought that concept was really interesting.
Hey, Lydia, can you talk a little, I appreciate that list. Can you talk a little bit about when you say you want to see more of management of carbon emissions? Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that specifically?
Well, any way that you can curtail, like in buildings, so that's might be a building use thing, but curtail the carbon emissions that we seem to be so good at using or producing. So that could be within building, within the amount of traffic that is generated, within building materials, that sort of thing.
Thanks for that clarification.
No problem. And that was my more list.
How about less? Anything on the less side?
Sure, I have things on the left side. Hang on. Waste of natural resources when building, the consumption of gas and electricity that are used by larger homes, perhaps mitigating with solar panels or something like that. The food insecurity and land use for growing crops caught my interest of late. And what I don't like to see is the green spaces not staying green, chopped up into 35-acre subdivided for large homes. So that would go on to the less sprawl in rural areas. Was that clear? Oh,
Yep. I think we're capturing that. That's great. And I think I acknowledge this is a big group. I think part of the challenge is we are not in a position right now to break into smaller groups virtually. So we'll do our best here with the large group that we have and give that some thought for future breakouts.
Well, I'm happy to go and I can try and just list a quick list if that's helpful.
Great, Blake, thank you.
Great. Well, green building and retrofit projects, more of a GMQS or a land use process that incentivizes development to contribute to community needs, whether it be retrofits, electrification, commissioning needs, infrastructure, community needs, like the new ambulance building, for instance, or employee housing. Incentives for renting to local residents. And I think then there's a lot of repetitive to what everyone else had said.
Yeah, how should we capture like the plus ones of the repeats?
I think we can do it that way. I was just going to say, Sierra, it's a good point. So as you see some of your colleagues or your committee member identifying some points, if you'd like to build on that or favor it, let's acknowledge that. Because what we'd like to do then is pull out some of the big themes in our report out and share them. And I think we'll also see some of those values beginning to emerge. So yes, +1 works for us, it works for all of you. And also if you want to refine some of that thinking from a point that was made previously, we can do that as well. Debbie, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I would like to see less large buildings that are not sustainably built. So I'd like to see, if we're going to have big buildings, big houses, can they be sustainably built? Can they basically generate their own energy for, especially things like snow melt, swimming pools, you know, those excess energy users? Can they somehow, you know, solar, however, geothermal, you know, heat pumps, however it can happen, generate or use a whole lot less energy than they do? And in reality, I guess I would just like to see less really big homes, because my, you know, from my observations, they use an incredible amount of energy, and just the number of trips people take to keep these buildings repaired and whatever else, you know, keep the people in the buildings happy, you know, clothed and fed and blah, blah, blah. So, I mean, it's, you know, just witnessing the amount of energy these big homes use, not just in keeping in the energy bill, but just the number of people who are always there taking care of either the homes themselves, the property around the home, or the people in the home. And just the number of car trips. It's incredible. And also then, is there some way to get them to be more sensitive to the environment? Because, you know, they don't recycle, they're so clueless as to the amount of energy they are actually, and resources they actually use. So it's kind of like, if you tell people they can't build a big home, maybe they'll go somewhere else.
I will just say 2 things quickly, Debbie. I appreciate you bringing that up. I feel like you've been consistent in bringing reality to the challenges, so thank you for that. I encourage us to explore the term sustainability. And the reason I say that, obviously I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but in the values that underlie some of the current code, they talk a lot about environmental preservation. What I've heard many of you talk about is sustainability in terms of green buildings or net zero energy buildings. I hear you talk about it in terms of waste and reducing consumption and waste generation. So how do we want to flesh out that word a little bit further so that there's clarity as we move forward here and identify some of those and link these concepts to some of the values. So would love to hear more about that.
Well, I think that's. Oh, I'm not.
Yep, you're good.
I was going to say, I mean, I think net zero is a great goal to strive for, but the way to get there is complicated, especially in our climate. And so, I think if net zero is the ultimate goal, I think there needs to be some clarity on, our offsite renewables, something that we can use. In Boulder, we build net zero houses, but they have solar farms offsite where they're using, solar power that is deed restricted to the house. And so, I think that would be everyone's goal. Personally, I think that's kind of what makes the most sense.
So there's a cleaner generation mix. There's a more efficient sort of envelope, or there's a more efficient home. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think it starts with the envelope, and then then it starts with alternate power sources. And
Thanks.
So let me see if I've got this right. So some options for offsite use of offsite renewable energy where on-site generation may not be ideal.
or even if it is ideal to kind of get the entirety of the house to offset, it may require offsite solar.
Thanks.
Just really quickly, any other, and we'll get to this probably through more discussion of more of LESA, but any other quick thoughts on what do we mean by that? When you talk about a more sustainable future. Debbie, I see your hand up. I don't know if that's a repeat, but why don't we go to you and then Brian on deck? Okay, sounds okay. Brian.
So Abby, I was kind of taking the approach of, the characteristics for the more and the less column. And so, for me, more renewable energy, more water reuse and recycling. And by the way, I didn't make a distinction between on-site or off-site renewable energy and, commercial mode on for a moment. I think it makes a big difference if the off-site renewables are significant. I think it'd be a different conversation if you were working with a utility that wasn't committed to it the same way that Holy Cross is. But yeah, use of renewables, water reuse and recycling, energy efficient construction. And that would apply to both new and retrofit construction, electrification, because of the underlying reduction in carbon that's coming from substituting electricity for fossil fuels. For me, some thoughts, walkable communities. We talk a lot about transportation and all the less ofs. I think walkable communities that have kind of a mixed use feel to it, where you don't have to walk terribly far, and it's safe to do so, right? So the smart urban design. I think another element would be live work opportunities for small business, so that someone could come in and start a small business and have a storefront and live above it, perhaps in a deed restricted sense, so that again, they're not commuting into and out of the valley. And then kind of materials reuse, recycling, repurposing of materials, and using materials that come from a more sustainable basis. And I see Sierra's note in the chat there. So these are kind of the things that are the more of, and then everything that I had on the less of side is pretty much the antonym to this, right? So instead of recycling and reuse, it's, one and done consumption, right? Instead of energy efficient homes, it's, energy inefficient homes and buildings. I would also throw the buildings in there. You get the point, right? That's kind of where I'm at. I'd like to see less sprawl. I'd like to see less congestion on the roads. I'd like to see less degradation of visual and habitats. These are some of the things that I've got on the less list, and I think I'll just stop there.
Ryan, I appreciate that. I feel like you started to tease out the broader concept of sustainability and pull that across sort of multiple sectors. I also appreciate you mentioning congestion. I'm surprised that it hasn't come up yet. Would love to hear more about that if others feel they want to speak to it. And Sierra and Jessica, I know you had some thoughts on the comment. If you feel on the chat stream, if you feel comfortable, would love to hear you vocalize some of those thoughts as well.
Sure, and I saw Forrest had his hand up too, so I didn't want to cut him in line.
Okay, you can go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You know, I've been moving away from the term sustainability because I feel like we can't sustain what's not working. I'm more interested in like living systems principles and this idea of regeneration and how do we sync up with the Earth's inherent capability to regenerate itself and stop getting in the way of that. So sustainability, yeah, I mean, in this context, I would like to see a lot less water waste. I'd like to see better management of our solid waste center and I guess more of a composting system that we can, that's residential and commercial across the valley, and a better system than shipping all of our recyclables to Denver. The water thing is a big one. I don't know how the irrigation problem is really bad, and like it's especially in some of those larger homes. I'd love to see more renewable energy infrastructure and green building as well, which was mentioned, more resilience planning and thinking, greater access, less roadkill, less carbon and toxic emissions, less sprawl, and less square footage. So I'll let somebody else speak up now. Hopefully those things are captured. But yeah, sustainability, interesting term, kind of has pros and cons, but circular economy stuff is also really exciting reframing of the issues as well. Like how can we be more circular in our actions here?
Yeah, I so appreciate all of that, particularly you continuing to bring up the water component. So thank you for that. And I'm also interested, this is the first time through this conversation, at least this small group conversation, that we've heard resilience. And so I'm curious to hear if any others have thoughts on that as it pertains to the future and what you want to see specifically more of and less of.
Yay, absolutely on that. I think the challenge is going to be that resilience requires, on the one hand, a design and a land use code that prioritizes resilience building investments. And then, by the contrary, it discourages the resilience degrading investments. And that means just not building in places that are likely to flood. That means thinking through how on-site renewables actually make more sense as a resilience measure as opposed to a green measure, given the underlying greenness of what we're going to get out of the electric system. It's just, again, if things are denser and they're more contained in a localized location and they're able to be self-sustained with water management on site, with energy provision on site, with food and supply chains kind of relatively self-contained, you've got more resilience, but obviously then you're sacrificing some of the economics to get that.
Yep. Brian, I appreciate that. And that's where my head went as well, sort of the connection between the resilience and the density, or the sort of the, I get there's no better word, right? The density of planning.
Well, and I'd add it's integration, Abby. I think we've got to also be thinking smartly about, do we want to have 28 single family homes all in a row without anything within 5 miles to support that infrastructure?
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Forrest, I know you've had your hand up for a while. We'll do Forrest, then Adam will go to you.
Yeah, so I know this really speaks more to the building code, but I've been thinking that maybe there's a way to add some zoning that can affect it, and that's demo. And demo in Pickens County, obviously more focused in city of Aspen, but even in the unincorporated is completely out of control and has not been managed at all until recently in the city and still not yet in the county. So I think that maybe there's a way we can, and this is a less of obviously, but leads into a more of, maybe there's a way we can set up a zoning so homes that are of a certain youth get a zoning on them when it's listed for sale, that at least manages the percentage of demo that's can be allocated. Because what's happening is they're buying new homes or 10-year-old or 20-year-old homes and taking them all the way down even through the foundation. And we all know that our our waste management facilities can't handle it. Our landfill is filling up. And if we can force people buying homes to be more creative in how they manage the home, in that they can get their design teams to at least use the structure and or the foundation to rebuild on or remodel on, I think that would go a long way in the carbon footprint of construction and growth going forward in the county. So definitely a building department thing, but maybe we can find a loophole in growth management to protect homes of a certain youth and a certain size, so they don't just get stripped down and shipped away anymore.
Forrest, great point. Really interesting. So that could either belong in the more of or the less of. We need to see less demolition as it contributes to waste and really activity, congestion, and so forth. So really interesting point. And would love to see if any others sort of agree or have additional thoughts there. Adam, let's go to you. Can you hear us, Adam?
Sorry, I'm sorry, are you saying Adam?
Adam, yep, sorry if I'm not clear. Yep, go ahead.
No, it's me. I'm driving right now. Everybody, I apologize. Yeah, what I'm hearing is great, especially in terms of, you know, the way we build, the way, you know, we look at our homes and the operations and, you know, more of the intent of the home size and how they operate. What I'm also hearing though is more of a land use pattern of how we want our land use to be in the county, more walkable, mixed use, live work, higher density. As it stands now, the land use code outside the urban growth boundary does not allow for any of that. So I would say we need more of a willingness and open-mindedness to look at the two competing, you know, attributes of our county, and that is rural and remote character and the way and the patterns of where and how we live. We need to look at some of the tools, the classic planning tools that are out there that apply to more, you know, of an urban context, and maybe rethink them in the context of our county character, especially up and down the 82 corridor. So I would say to achieve what we're talking about isn't just to start doing more of it. It's a major shift from how we have looked at our comprehensive plan in the county for decades and decades and decades. And that's a willingness and an open-mindedness to look at opportunities for transit-oriented development along Highway 82. Maybe there's some other patterns that are closer into our urban areas, quoting urban areas, that are still better than driving 30 or 40 miles to get to an employment center, but it's not the same pristine character, you know, protection that we've always had along the 82 scenic corridor. These are big conversations in the community though, and I think we have to be honest that unless there's an open-mindedness and willingness to relook at how we grow and develop and accommodate some of the things like, you know, local resident housing, mixed use, you know, character and pattern, I don't think we have a lot of opportunity to get there with any, you know, substantial change. So I would say from the resilience of the community standpoint, those are the areas that we have to be honest about. What does that look like? And is there enough open-mindedness and willingness to change some of those kind of decade-old standards for how we view our county land use pattern?
Adam, thank you for that. I want to make sure that I understand that we're capturing it clearly. Are you sort of proposing that sort of you rethink some of the sort of the patterns that inform the rural character today? So outside of the urban growth boundaries.
I think so. I think if we're going to accomplish some of the points that this group is talking about, I think the larger committee is talking about, we have to be honest that we don't have many land opportunities to do that. The urban growth boundary is pretty choked up. there's not a lot of new opportunities for finding, you know, high density, mixed use type new growth. If we want to consider that, you know, those aspects of part of the more community sustainable goals that we're trying to accomplish here, we have to be honest and relook at some of our more rural areas that may be close to transit, that may be close to, you know, other opportunities where that would make sense. But that has not been an easy conversation over decades past. But if these are the goals, those are the honest things we need to be looking at. So again, I know it's a little bit of a deviation off of, you know, what more of and less of, but I would frame it as more of a willingness, more of an open-mindedness to look at our land use patterns that aren't the same old way of looking at them, because we're going to have to do that to accomplish some of the community sustainability attributes that we're striving towards. And I am driving, I apologize. I can put this in the requested email, you know, kind of summary, just so it's encapsulated better. I know it was kind of a long, you know, long point there.
No, we appreciate your clarification. I think we've captured the sort of the essence of it, but you know, feel free if you feel like it hasn't been captured accurately, Adam, we can always build that out of it. So thank you. What I would like to do is take a couple more comments, and then what I'd like to do is for all of us to take a look at this list, make sure that there isn't anything else that you would like to add, and then start to group in terms of the values that we talked about leading up to this conversation. So what I'd like to do, I believe Lydia and then Forrest, if you have another comment, and I want to take a few moments, and I see there's a couple of comments in the chat, so we'll do our best to incorporate those into the list that Emma's pulling together as well. So Lydia, final thoughts here? Oh, it looks like you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Anyway, I looked up sustainability, and this makes it really clear for me. And sustainability means meeting our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think that makes it really clear.
Yes, and completely agree with you, and that's helpful just to level set. And I think where I was going, and Brian was really helpful in sort of teasing it out, is what does it actually mean when we talk about more of less of? So let's get beyond the word and what does it look like? And I think you've all done such a good job of clarifying that and refining that definition. So, so thank you for that, Lydia.
Yeah.
Forrest, anything else from your perspective? And then we'll do one last kind of look here at the list. And I see, Brian, your comment. Yep, we'll add Jessica's comments as well to this.
No, I totally agree with Adam, that it's definitely a shift in mindset, but what happens sometimes, especially in rural communities, to go on to his point, is that they are stuck in tradition. They are used to what they've had for long periods of time. And so that mindset shift usually comes after something catastrophic has happened. And instead of preemptive shift in mindset, which is what we need to look at, because our county is going to continue to grow. People are going to continue to move here. People from the cities that are getting wealthier are going to continue to come out to move into the rural areas and the spaces, especially as people continue to threaten about more pandemics and such. So this is why I think the land use code can play a part in that mindset shift, in that it will open up new zoning regulations to do these community-based things. And I think, to be honest, like the Highway 82 corridor is not as scenic as people think it is. If you really pay attention when you drive down it now, it's not like driving through the Alps, as Glenn had mentioned. You know, and one thing about driving through the Alps is geographically and topography and geography, it's probably not buildable between the towns, which is one of the reasons that they don't get built in between, whereas we are actually buildable along the corridor. So I totally agree with Adam in that, and just finishing off the point there, really appreciate his sentiment.
Right. Let's do one last sort of glance at this list and make sure there's nothing else that you as a group here would like to add or clarify. And what I'm doing right now is just putting the, hopefully you can all see this. I'm not sure that you can, but I'm putting the values that we talked about into the chat. And so as we look at this list, what we'd like to do is start to group some of these according to the values to help inform the report out. It may also be that some of these more of less of points that you talked about do not fit within the values, which is informative in and of itself. It may actually support the generation of a new value. And so can you all see that, the list that I just put in? You can see it, okay. Great,
I'll also type it on screen here so we can see it.
that's great, thanks, Emma.
Mhm.
So let's take a quick glance at everything that we've contributed and done our best to sort of capture from the conversation. And I'll do the same, as there was a lot that was being shared. So just take a moment to look through this.
I don't
There
know.
are some clear themes.
The composting point, maybe could go next to the recycling. Sorry, I just don't want to forget about that.
In the more of, Sierra?
Yes.
Yep. Recycling and composting. Okay, perfect. That's great. Yeah, starting to group some of these themes.
Should net zero and deed restricted workforce housing be the same topic, or are those two different topics?
Who was it that made that comment? I can't recall.
I did, and I think it's one topic.
Okay.
So they were talking about actually in this particular article I read, taking like a commercial building, rezoning it to residential and building it as a net zero deed restrictive building.
Got it.
So it seems like I'm going to take a stab here and let's just have like an iterative conversation, a couple of themes that are coming out of this. So there's a whole group around sort of rethinking the planning and zoning component. Perhaps more transportation oriented development, perhaps more mixed use, perhaps more affordable housing. There's sort of that bucket. There's a whole piece around more, for lack of a better word, sort of climate sensitive or climate intentional building. Everything from construction to how a building is energized, how it operates, and then the demolition of those buildings. It feels like there's a whole piece there. There's a big piece around, which includes Sierra, which includes the water component as well, not just energy, but also water. It feels like there's a whole component here around resilience, both resilience and sort of integrative design as a broader category. On the less of, big one, less or fewer large homes, right? I mean, that seems to sort of stick out from all of this. Less consumption, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the word, and the impacts that come from that consumption. Less sprawl. So I'm jumping around a little bit, but the other piece that I miss is I'm acknowledging also is just in terms of the planning and more walkable communities, right? That was a big theme from the conversation that we had. What are other big themes? And again, there's a lot here, right? It's a lot to digest for those of us that need to take time to digest. It's a lot, but do those feel like some of the big themes? Are there others that I may have missed?
But the
No, I think you did a good job.
Oh yeah.
Thank you, Sierra.
Good.
Sierra, please. Yeah, what did we miss?
Just the mindset conversation a little bit. I think there's something about culture change and kind of the character of the community and that, like, how does this place feel? So I don't really know how to encapsulate that in a theme, but I'm sensing that there's more of a shift that needs to happen in terms of culture and kind of who we are and who we want to be.
Openness to sort of
open-mindedness.
Yes, absolutely. No. Yeah. Yep. Really important piece. Look, feel, and function. Just as reminders. Yes, Brian. And Forrest and Lydia, I don't know if you're on deck there, but we'll keep you on deck Yep.
Abby, I wonder if alongside less large homes, we're really talking about material consumption,
Mhm.
right? We're
Mhm.
talking about recycling, reuse, repurposing, some of the concerns around demolition and scrape and rebuild, right? So I think it's not just, we want everything to be smaller. It's like we want everything to be done with less material usage.
So it's not, Brian, it's not necessarily the consumption or the waste that comes from the building itself, but it's also how the building is built. Is that a fair?
Well, yeah, ultimately, if you're recycling, reusing, and repurposing, then you have less waste, right? If we think about what it is that, how do we define sustainability to Lydia's definition? It's the creation of waste impacts, water impacts, air impacts, climate impacts. It's kind of a low impact way of thinking that you're manifesting that in what materials you use, if you even use them at all, where you build, if you even build at all, where you travel, if you travel at all. And the ifs are really important because that's where the integrative design comes in. If I can walk to something, I don't get in the car and I don't create the transport impacts. I don't burn the fuel. I don't have the need for parking, right? It kind of cascades onto itself, but it really comes back down to kind of minimizing the consumption associated with all of these activities.
And I would say, I mean, adding to it's intentional and integrative design.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking so much about intention. So.
And
Okay.
I guess the last thing I'd say is if we're also valuing the rural and remote character, then the where matters as much as the what too, right? That we might say we're okay with a, very dense footprint inside of a very small defined space if what it does is helps us prioritize and preserve the rural and remote character or the historic preservation in the case of an existing structure elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because sort of thinking about resilience and how do you build out sort of in line with existing infrastructure, but where might there be pockets of density, perhaps outside of your urban design core, where you can start to drive, to build in some resilience as well. So it's interesting. Other themes like, yeah, go ahead, sorry, Adam.
This is Adam again. And yeah, I think what Brian said, and then also, I think it was, who spoke before? Was it Sierra? I think that community character has to come from how and where. And that is that point. Where can people who create the character we want, where can they live anymore? If we don't have the room in the urban growth boundary, where can we find opportune locations to create that community resilience? So we have that as part of our broader county community character as well. And I know that kind of relates to what I said prior, but I think that's a recurring theme of what we want for creating the character, not keeping out what we don't want. But if we're going to create things that we're losing, we have to take a fresh look at how and where, we provide those opportunities.
Oh, that how and where. Yep. So we have about 5 minutes. And we've done a little bit of this, but it looks like, Emma, that you're starting to highlight some of those key themes that we talked about. And then Chelsea, just let me finish my point, and then Chelsea, I'll go to you. So then in terms of reporting out, it would be helpful to begin to align some of these things to our values, to understand where there is alignment and where there might be points of tension. So I'd like to do that for the last 5 minutes. Before we do go there, Chelsea, thoughts, comments?
Sure. I just, I really appreciate what Brian said first, and then Adam kind of reiterated, because those are your feedback and kind of consolidating the value of all the various suggestions of what we want more of and less of helps give us the tools to make the informed decisions as a planning and zoning voting board member, and the action of like specifically rezoning certain areas, knowing that this is a priority and this is a designated value that we're striving towards. So I couldn't be happier to hear you guys say that, because I see that need too, and we just need the the support behind us as a community in order to feel confident in making those decisions. So I'm really happy to hear what you're saying and how you're honing in on important issues. So thanks.
So the process is working. That's good. Other quick thoughts?
I guess I'm not sure it's community held, but I think it's an aspiration of like a value of responsibility and taking responsibility for our community. So I'm not quite sure where that belongs.
Well, we'll capture it and then let's pull it in as we can. So are there any, let's take a look at the values, climate action, environmental sustainability. We talked a lot about that. In a lot of respects, intentional design to minimize some of the impact, the climate impact, the consumption, the waste that comes from that. Healthy, resilient, inclusive economy. We talked a lot about building out communities that are, like you made the really good point, that's sort of in line with community benefit, which I think speaks to this point very well in terms of affordability and other desirable aspects of the community. But I'd love to allow you to talk more to that if you would like.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. I think really I was just trying to say if we could, the land use currently GMQS is not very effective because people are sort of skirting it. And so what if instead of grading it on, the criteria now, we could expand that and all of a sudden they can be graded on, have the benefit of this project to the community. And maybe that means, the ambulance project that they're asking taxpayers for, maybe that's something that, a project could use to kind of increase its rate, or maybe they're putting additional funds into employee housing. Maybe they're paying for things that benefit the schools. Maybe it's things that, I think in general, it's probably going to be a very efficient building, but I think that, if someone had a comment at the end of last meeting, like, look at how many solar panels you could buy with a TDR. I mean, so currently we have a revenue stream with development, and it's certainly something that could generate, or at least provide, a significant benefit to the community. Now, what that looks like, I think needs to be in line with everyone's goals, but I think that, you have something that could certainly benefit the community as a whole in many different ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Blake, is that in terms of both, it's getting a little tactical here, but both in terms of how projects are scored. So it's a scoring criteria, but it might also just be the incentives that are built into the exemptions process.
Right. Like maybe, I mean, they mentioned Prince Bandar like bought a CAT scan machine, which kind of sounds kind of silly at the time, but I was thinking about, like, if you're sick and you need to go get a CAT scan and you can go to Aspen Valley instead of drive to Denver. I mean, that's a pretty big deal. And so I think potentially that the community could benefit from development, in a symbiotic relationship.
No, I appreciate that idea. Chelsea, did you have something else? Okay.
Nope, sorry, lowering hand. Sorry.
No worries. I mean, my sense is looking down this list of values, we have hit all of them. We don't have to go through it sort of line by line, but my sense is that we've hit all of them. I'm curious if you see other values that are not, and maybe Sarah, this is your point where responsibility comes in. So we might want to just acknowledge that as well. Responsibility to a community. Brian.
I'm looking at the list of values and the themes, and I'm thinking, how far do we go in thinking about the where? How far do we go in defining, almost like we did at a statewide level with renewable energy development? We said, these are the zones where you can develop and these are the zones where you can't. And I'm almost at a point of wondering if we're trying to prioritize and value rural preservation and quality of life, as well as carrying capacity. We're getting perilously close, in my point of view, to basically saying this is a go zone, that's a no zone.
Right.
And I mean, how far do we want to go? I think that's a question for the the group to consider.
Yep, yep, that's a great point.
Because then you can say, if you define the go zones, then you can really engage in a robust, integrated and integrative planning process and say, all right, within this area, right? Let's say we define a new area adjacent to 82 to Foster's comment, where, okay, we're going to allow for some development, right? We can actually design it right from the get-go and say, okay, we're going to design it with this sort of integration and thinking and resilience and mix of A's and B's and C's and D's, and kind of define that as the carrying capacity of this pocket that we've said is okay is this much, and it will not be any more than that. And anybody that wants to develop in there, you're going to have to abide within that boundary, period, full stop.
And I would argue you might apply that same thinking to other, not just the where, but the what. How prescriptive, to your point, how prescriptive do you want to be?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern California, and it was always astonishing to me that we would have an article on the front page of the LA Times that would decry the lack of water for existing residences, and then there'd be an ad right next to it for an 800 house subdivision. And I would think to myself, clearly our objectives are not aligned if we're A, running out of water, but B, building more consumption of it. So how do we solve for all of that at once? And if we're truly thinking about carrying capacity in the biological sense, then there's only so many people with so many activities that we can squeeze into the valley.
It's a great illustration of that conflict. Okay, good. Well, I think that we're probably at time. What I'd like to do is just maybe give you all a chance to sort of collect some of your thoughts. I will do my best to sort of share some of the highlights from this discussion, but would really, unless one of you would like to take it on, I would be happy to share in that. So just let me know, or feel free to jump in. Okay. Great. All right. Well, thanks all for your contributions, and then we'll see how our conversation sort of compares to the other conversations that were had in the room.
And thanks for your awesome facilitation, Abby.
Okay. Well, you're welcome, Sierra. All right. We'll see you on the flip side here.
Emma, have they not started back yet, or?
I believe they're still in their breakouts right now,
Okay.
but they should be
Just
finishing
making
up
sure I
soon.
wasn't the only one not hearing.
No.
Yeah, I was wondering the same thing. Boy. Yeah.
All those virtual folks, their room is so much cleaner than ours. Thanks, sir.
It was difficult. We had a lot of
Going back to where we
ideas
used to be?
coming at you.
No, we're doing it.
Yes.
Okay. Abby and Emma and Ellen on our virtual team, can you hear us okay?
We can, yep.
Excellent. As you might imagine, it's taken a minute longer to put our physical room back together. The virtual breakout so much.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as we get settled in, since I think our virtual group was probably the most efficient, I'm gonna give you all some kudos. Why don't we start with our virtual report out, and then we'll go group 1, and then we'll go group 2. And I think as we go through, I'm hoping there's gonna be a lot of big themes that we can cover. And maybe it'll make it easier and shorter as we go group by group, because I'm seeing a lot of commonality in our list. So I found this was a great discussion. Group 2, how was it for you? Good?
We're all over the place.
I think that's okay at this stage. That's intentional. So Abby and Emma, do you want to lead us out on reporting our virtual more of less of lists, which I think we've got on screen here. We may want to make it just slightly bigger.
Yeah, like way bigger.
Thank you.
Yes, we can do that. And I'm just going to acknowledge, I know that there's a lot of energy in the room, and it's just a little bit hard to hear if there's folks talking. So it's a good sign, but if we can just try to minimize that for the folks online, that would be great. So I will jump in. We had a very robust discussion, and I will try to hit some of the highlights. And I think the folks on the team can really provide some of the nuance. So in terms of more of or less of, and it may or may not align to what you're seeing on the screen, so we'll jump around a bit, but we've talked a lot about intentional planning, thinking about multifamily, thinking about walkable communities, mixed use development, transportation oriented development, smart urban design, places where folks can live and work. So there was a whole conversation around that. We also talked a lot about design, integrative and intentional design, both in terms of what is designed and where it is designed. And so the theme of resilience came out here. How prescriptive do we want to be in terms of where development happens, with a specific focus on rural character, but also resilience? And so that's a question that we'd like to pose to the team for future conversation. We also talked with respect to design about climate intentional building. And this really sort of runs the gamut from thinking about the generation, the electricity generation mix, to the efficiency of the buildings, thinking about electrification, and thinking about this also in terms of recycling and waste, in terms of materials, but also the consumption that homes drive. There was also an interesting piece around more of a cultural mind shift, or an openness to new ways of thinking about development, perhaps in the rural area or rural character. What does it look like? How might we define it differently? How might we stay open to some new opportunities there? And so the team may want to jump in there as well. And then the last piece we wanted to see more of was really growth aligned to community benefit. So whether that comes through the GMQS, or perhaps getting rid of exemptions, or ensuring that exemptions align with our values as we've articulated here, really thinking about how we specifically align growth to community benefit. So I'm going to shift over to less of, and then I'm going to give the team an opportunity to weigh in here. In terms of less of, sort of very to the point, fewer large homes. But not just the large homes, sort of thinking about that in terms of less waste in general. Less waste in terms of the materials that go into building larger homes, and also the waste that is derived from those larger homes, be it energy, water, municipal waste. So just thinking about the sort of the whole cycle of that piece. Less sprawl and congestion, and I think that goes back to the planning for resilience. How prescriptive do we want to be about where and how we build? And I think that generally gets to it. So team, I just want to open it up quickly to see if I miss any core points or key points that you would like to articulate. I will take no offense, jump in there, clarify, or correct. Good. Okay. Well, Miles, there you go. So that's kicking off, and you'll see where we have the pluses. that's where just folks really emphasize their support for some of these concepts.
Excellent, very succinct, and yeah, I hope we can all follow suit. I think for us, I was going through and highlighting for group one was really well aligned, and there was a lot of commonality. You can see in some of the gold highlights here, talking about the word intentionality came up a ton in our group as well, and being intentional about the planning and design. And then thinking about those incentives for green building, certainly that came up a lot in the virtual group as well, preserving rural lands. And the concept of values aligned with action. I think that's another one that really came up a lot in our group. But outside of that, thinking about flexibility in the TDR program, looking at what's working well and what's not working well, and how that relates to our definition of community carrying capacity and that value. Looking at creative ways to use TDR sales to advance climate action priorities. And I'm going to stay on the TDR train here. I'm starting to jump down a little bit. In the concept of preserving those rural lands, how can we use TDRs to encourage that and pacing the amount of construction? And then there was a lot of conversation around affordable housing and the different types of affordable housing, finding balance in the employer driven and the public affordable housing efforts, and thinking about the existing housing stock versus new housing stock for affordable housing. How do we maybe create more access to affordable housing within the existing stock? Going down to the bottom of our list here, more intention on what we want to avoid versus what we want to mitigate. I think that's kind of, as we look at our tools, going to be a big driver of what the land use code can and can't do. Making sure I didn't miss anything here. I think I'm going to flip over to less of, and then let the group add color where I missed some key points. But a point came up that we're really reaching a point of no return on a lot of these critical issues, from fossil fuel use when we're talking about wildfire risk, and certainly landscaping, particularly wasteful water usage. The second bullet, no bluegrass yards, period. I think that was one of the big less ofs that came out of our group. We had a lot of very definitive less ofs, water waste, particularly as it relates to very consumptive agricultural, maybe non-essential uses. Second homes, that was another hard stop in the less of, and the values in parentheses around community carrying capacity. Restrictions on affordable housing. We want to see less of that, of course. TDRs for large homes, maybe gradually extinguishing them for large square footage builds. This was another overlap with the waste concept from the virtual breakout group. Less waste through less demolition and less demolition permits, sorry, and more longevity of those homes. Less enabling a culture of consumption. Could even use the word hypocrisy, came up in our group, vis-a-vis square footage, and making sure we align our actions with our values, and then having that consistent message. Less greenhouse gas emissions, certainly, and tracing that back to home management services and some of those ancillary activities. The private aviation is something that is a big driver for greenhouse gases that came up in our group. And then related traffic congestion, but just general congestion as a whole. And I think of that list we started with from Michael, just sort of that culture of busyness that we're, I think, all feeling. And then a big one that I want to highlight at the end here is GMQS exemptions. I think that was one of those that came up later in our discussion as a pretty definitive point that group one wanted to make. But I've been talking enough. Mona and the rest of you, what did I miss?
Well, I would like to add what Cindy told us, is that looking at this list of items that we came up with, about 80% of them can be done through the land use code. And I think that, to me, that's really heartening, because you start thinking about some of these, and somebody brought up, how are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do? And so if we can really start putting the land use code filter and vice versa through these, then we can start to see how we can achieve the goals that we're trying to with this committee. So I appreciated that.
And other group ones, yeah.
I really appreciate this forum, because it's been a long time since I've participated in something like this, and it's very refreshing. And I think being able to speak, out loud about what you're carrying for other people is the key to the case if we're really building a dynamic. Max was concerned maybe this was too disruptive, but I think most of our successes have come from someone being disruptive. And I'm all in on that point because limitations are being imposed on us right now by Mother Nature and by capacity on a highway and the amount of water that's available to serve 140 homes that I'm engaged with. And we're going to have these things come down on us regardless of how many attempts we make to mitigate or be intentional. So that to me says there's got to be a process where we can accelerate it before that happens to us. And you can see what happened in California with fires when simple things like taking care of your landscaping weren't paid attention to, or building in high-risk areas, Colorado Springs. These things are coming to us. We're not in control of that. But there are things we can control in land use that I think this has been very productive. Thanks, everybody. Because I'm going to take this back to my relationships in the Mid-Valley Eagle to the electeds and say, look, this is a serious conversation. We need to be aware of it, get engaged in it, and do whatever we can to get that 40-mile corridor in agreement. The direct democracy thing I was told is wonderful, but if you get 4 votes out of 7, you win. We need 7-0.
Right. I think that's such a good point. That's come up a lot in our meetings, that the ultimate recommendations that this group produces, there's going to be much more strength behind them, the more consensus that we have. And this group was selected because of the diversity that it represents. So getting to that common ground and bringing forward those common ground recommendations are going to be where the real strength lies. And I think that was very well said. Cindy, are you gonna come?
Yeah, just a couple things that I think, this group said so many things, but a couple notable ones too is reevaluating zoning in general. I don't know that we had that, if we talked about that there, I'm sorry to have missed it. And then also prioritization of approvals. If we say what we want, prioritizing what gets approved in terms of what we want and putting other things lower down on the list as far as the approvals. I thought those were 2 more big ones but we'll combine all our notes because there was so much flying.
And we're going to filter them to the values and what the code can and can't do. But Mona's point that when we heard from Cindy, about 80% of this can be traced back to land use code changes. I think it was a breath of fresh air for us. So any other group 1 comments? We should go to group 2 because I know it's at 6:20 and we built in some time. So Marcy, thank you so much.
Okay, see if I can do this justice. I'm going to start with the less of, which there were quite a few less of bullet points than the more of. Less traffic, fewer short-term rentals, less loopholes, particularly in the GMQS system and TDRs. Correct me if I get any of this wrong, group 2. Fewer gas-powered vehicles, fewer national retail chains, less complexity in the land use code. Right now, it sort of seems like a game. We heard that repeated a few times. Fewer exemptions in the land use code. And I'll move over to the more of column. More native vegetation, respect for the environment, and education for visitors to the area about our values. More affordable housing, more affordable restaurants. Working with neighboring communities on affordable housing. Again, more regulation of the STRs. Rural and remote zoning is definitely a priority for this group, and we did talk about zoning in general and how zoning could be reevaluated. More walkability. Let's see. Coordinate the land use, consider both the land use code and transportation, sort of in one train of thought. Continued acquisition of open space and prioritization of rural spaces. Progressive values like green building and environmentally conscious design. More intelligent land use code that reflects the complexity of what we're dealing with today in modern era. More social support for locals, and again, sort of following along the theme of green, new construction offering carbon footprint offsets. And I know I forgot things, so I'm going to lean on group 2 members to please weigh in and speak up about important things that I may have left out here.
Marcy, thank you so much.
Actually, I don't think we talked about less TDRs as much as a redo of TDRs to yield a better result. Not necessarily.
And I think there's a really good conversation about TDRs have a value, and I don't want to see TDRs go away. We just want to like see how they're sent and where they're sent be redone.
Well, and we discussed more combining the TDR program with the GMQS. There's an overlap there, and making the TDR landing more reflective of what the community values are in the GMQS scoring system.
And I think the one other point was a prioritization of permits, incentivizing smaller homes or prioritizing that first. And then that also kind of ties in with planning. Those that are green projects, smaller homes, prioritizing them through either GMQS or some system, then those that would be a larger type project.
Is it time for question?
And I want to make sure we hear from all the group 2s. I know, Rick, you're so eloquent. I hate to say, let's see, make sure we get any color commentary from our group 2s. And we've got 5 minutes left. So I want to quickly go to where we're going from here and then have some open.
Okay, well, I had a question for group 2 as well.
Oh, perfect. Great. Let's go. there. Sorry.
I'd like to expand on your thoughts on convincing Carbondale, Isabel, to create more housing. Only because they are, but they're creating it for their own workforce. So I want to put that out there and, you know,
More
suggest.
for picking.
No, not for chicken. Sorry, but it could be partnership where it benefits that corridor. So I don't want to leave it off the table, but I'm just suggesting that that's what they're doing is trying to solve their problem. And what we're trying to do is solve this problem. And, you know.
We only said that because it's so unaffordable to live the farther up the valley for the people who are, that's.
Yeah.
So then we said we wanted more affordable restaurants, and we kind of.
And that's so complimentary of what group 1 talked about too, in terms of more creative partnerships with municipalities that have urban growth boundaries, because greenhouse gases, you know, some of the climate impacts, affordable housing, those things don't just stop at municipal or county lines. So the regionality, I think it was Emma's first bullet tonight when she was summarizing our last meeting, that's a huge area of focus, and that's absolutely where we're going. So with the few minutes we have remaining, Emma, if we could pull up slide 14, I believe it is, that just kind of shows how we're getting into that evolution of focus areas, kind of the process and drafting. What we've been doing is really looking at the history and the current state, the values and the mega trends, and then tonight beginning to focus on the problems that we're trying to solve and the component parts, exactly what we talked about tonight, what we want to see more of and less of. So bringing that into, and there's going to be a lot of synthesis with these lists that we looked at tonight, a lot of commonality, but also a lot of really important points that we have to make sure are captured in this analysis and brought into how can we then begin to categorize where are the levers, where are the tools in the land use code that we want to focus on, call them our guiding principles, call them our areas of focus, that begin to then structure what recommendations we want to bring forward in those various categories. And this is more of an art than a science. This is just a process to begin narrowing our scope of where we're going to go from here. And then that will bring us to underneath those big pillars of focus, what are the recommendations? What are the specifics? It was hard for our group to get away from, well, if we're talking about fewer second homes and we're looking at models in Europe, what are some of the policy tools? How do we enforce that? So there's a lot of levers that we're going to need to explore underneath those big focus areas. And I think some of those focus areas are very clearly starting to emerge from this group. So that's going to be the hard work of the co-chairs and the planning team before our next meeting to kind of bring those areas into some sort of summary so you all can react to them. But that's a general process to begin narrowing our scope. And certainly we're going to be bringing in the data to look at where, when we're talking about levers, where do we actually need to understand what the data is telling us. John?
I have a question just because of through each group, it was pretty evident that rural character was kind of more rural character, preserving rural character. And I think there's one area that I stumble on and I struggle with, and that is the longtime farmer that's been here who potentially does not want to sell his TDRs because that's not what he believes in. What are the incentives that we can keep that guy around? And that I struggle with that. I don't know what the answers are, but I know that, you know, we've lost an enormous amount of land area that was agriculture within this valley corridor, just to development or what have you. And if rural character is something that we're truly trying to preserve, then I think we need to think about incentives to try and keep that. I don't know what it is, but just throwing it out there.
Yeah, I mean, rural preservation.
Especially if it's not TDR.
Yeah, is a very clear value to John, to your point. It's one of those core 6 values that we looked at. And then the conversation I heard from all the groups is the role of TDRs. They're a powerful tool. How do we look at what's working well, maybe what can be improved and harness some of that energy?
As I would just add, I mean, I think this group started to venture into areas of sort of thinking, perhaps having an open mind, thinking perhaps differently about the rural character or areas of potential growth within our rural space. So Adam and Brian can probably articulate that better, but I think we're starting to sort of push on that concept a little bit, which we can explore in future conversations.
And if I may add, I think that is juxtaposed with the desire for rural preservation and less sprawl. So it'll be a good puzzle to work on.
Any other final thoughts from the group before we adjourn tonight? Yeah, Tim.
Can we ask staff to, or maybe it already exists, to do research on European mountain towns and other US towns that have already dealt with some of these issues that are in the process of, so we can learn from what others have done?
Absolutely. I think creating a resource library is one of the things we've talked about in terms of, there's been a lot of interesting articles really recently that address what we've been talking about, but then looking at models. I think, Tim, that's a great point, especially as we start to look at data. You know, what does that data tell us about other places who have used levers that we're looking at to really make a sizable change in the quantifiable data? So I think that's a very good point, and where we're going to be going with some of our next meetings as we begin to look at some of that data and the tools that we have. So if we go to the next slide here, our next meeting, and I know we're 1 minute over on this one, and we had a 4:30 start. So we're gonna be back to the 4 o'clock start next time, November 2nd. We're gonna be back Mid-Valley at that great room at Rocky Mountain Institute. We're gonna be working into some data, then we'll be back up here on November 16th. And as always, you're gonna be getting a lot of emails from us, so hopefully a lot of resources. Please feel free to be sharing all of the information as you have. And we've got a lot of more of less of to collate, and I want to flip it to Kara.
I just have actually one question for this group. I think as we move forward, there's a lot of demands for kind of context setting. So I guess I have a question of, as kind of planning staff sees that the memos are valuable, are you all okay with me move from that commitment to 1 week before to the Friday before and have some grace in getting the packets out?
Sure.
Okay.
I think that'd be great. And I think everybody, you weren't here, but everybody commented, okay,
Yes,
the memo
yeah,
is
yeah.
very well done. So thank you.
Thank you. So we can continue to work on those memos as needed. It's just having a little grace of Fridays instead of Wednesdays will be valuable to the planning team.
Well, thank you. all of you, and thank you, Mona, for stepping in with and without Michael today. It's great to have the co-chairs on board, so we look forward to seeing you all again on November 2nd.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Bye.
Questions?
One